Welcome to another episode of Mindful City, Tuning into Life, a podcast to discover and celebrate the many ways that our city is using mindfulness in our practical daily lives. Welcome to another episode of Mindful City, Tuning into Life. And today we have as our guest Melanie Camellia from Found Space Yoga. And I found Melanie on Instagram. And when I looked up, it was actually a program in Georgia, I believe, in Atlanta. And when I looked up Melanie's profile, I have to read it to you because it is what just drew me to you. And it says, fat, queer, non-binary, adaptive yoga teacher, writer, and agency access advocate in DC. And I thought these are so many aspects that I find myself in, categories that I find myself in, but also a lot of the reasons why I didn't do yoga. And so I was so intrigued because I thought, I know for sure I'm not the only one. And I said, I have to get to know you and speak to you, introduce you to the community on Mindful City. So I wanted to welcome you to the show. Also, I told you before we started the interview that I am terrible at introductions. And so I thought it would be way better if you could share a little bit about who you are and your journey and how you came to yoga.
Hi, thank you. Yeah. My bio says a lot of it, not necessarily the whole winding story to get to where we are, but in terms of who I am and what I do, I am a yoga teacher and an advocate within the industry, and I think outside of the industry a little bit too, for access, for agency, for better representations of diverse people and identities and bodies everywhere. I mean, in the media, in the yoga industry, in other mindfulness and wellness spaces. I wear a lot of different hats, and I do a lot of different jobs, ranging from teaching classes in yoga studios in the DC metro area, and working with individual one-on-one private clients and teaching mentees. And then I also, kind of all the way up to roles helping to manage a couple of organizations that are a little larger, national and international scale. So I work with accessible yoga. I work with the Yoga and Body Image Coalition. I came to yoga a number of years ago in a very different time in my life. So, you said that all those descriptors in my bio that resonated with you were a lot of the reasons you didn't do, Western studio yoga as it shows up. And I think if my life had looked like it did now, I wouldn't have found yoga, at least not when I did, right? At that time, I was struggling so hard with body image, with my identity. And it was actually that struggle that ended up sort of roundabout way taking me into a yoga studio for the first time. I had an eating disorder that also involved a lot of excessive exercise. And so as I was doing all of this other exercise and training for triathlons and other distance races, somebody was like, you need to balance that out. You should go to a yoga class and stretch. And so that's what got me into a studio, was actually this kind of unhealthy behavior. I was really sick. And somebody was like, go stretch it out after all of that cardio. So I ended up in a studio. At the time, my body was so different because I had been struggling with eating and with movement. So I was never skinny, but I looked a little more like your standard, idolized Western yoga stereotype, right? And I really wasn't to terms with my gender identity at the time either. I identify as agender and non-binary, meaning that the idea of any gender really doesn't resonate with me. I just don't identify with a gender, period, which takes me off of that traditional binary, that constructed binary of there being just men and women. And so in that vein, I use the pronouns they and them. But
Do
I
you
wasn't.
feel, I wonder, because now when I'm speaking to you,
Yeah.
we're more mindful of these various categories that are
Mm-hmm.
there. At the time when you went to the yoga studio, did you
Mm-hmm.
feel, because when I think of yoga, I think of welcoming and that everybody
Mm-hmm.
is, I never saw it as anything other than that.
Yeah.
But then when I, saw the trend and I'm like, nobody looks like me.
Mm-hmm.
There's just no way.
Yeah.
How were you accepted it? Did you even have a concept that there was some categorization, or were you in that mindset? You went,
Yeah.
you were invited to go, and you
Mm-hmm.
went for your healing. What
Yeah.
was your experience?
Well, I guess like what I'm trying to get at is that my experience was that I was welcomed, but I think part of the reason that I felt welcomed at the time was that I was ticking some of these boxes that fit
Oh, I see.
within the stereotype of a yoga practitioner in the West, where I was smaller than I am now. I was, in shape, I suppose. I was, presenting more femininely because I wasn't really in touch with my gender identity or lack thereof. And I was trying really hard to fit into those boxes so that I could be included and feel welcome, not just in yoga spaces, but every space. and
Exactly.
and so when I started that practice, when I went in there to get that stretch after, running 20 miles or whatever it was, I did feel welcomed. And that's something that kept me coming back. But along the way, right, I got in touch with the practice beyond the physical. I started to learn a lot more about the philosophy. I started to practice more mindfulness, more aspects of meditation myself. And I got in touch with some of my social justice roots as well around the same time, something that had been really important to me as a teenager and in college. And then I feel like I had been just so worried about being included in the adult United States like economy and world that it had kind of fallen to the wayside, and I was really reconnecting to it. And so throughout that process, yoga certainly helped me become conscious of how sick I was with my eating disorder, how out of touch with myself I was in a pretty toxic relationship, a romantic relationship at the time, in a job that really didn't resonate for me. Basically just felt like I was living a lie a lot of the time. And yoga is part of what helped me figure that out and realize that I had a lot more work to do. And I started to do that work. I was in therapy and I was healing and trying to heal my relationship with my body and my body image, trying to heal my relationship with myself and the level of trust that I could have in myself, because I felt like, at that time, I felt like more than anybody else had betrayed me,
Right.
that I had betrayed me, right? And through that process, as I'm healing, I was also gaining weight because I was no longer engaging in disordered eating behavior. I was connecting to things that I wanted more, letting myself live my life. But as my body changed and as I became aware of so many other things going on for me that I had just drowned out because there was too much already going on for
Right.
me, right? I started to notice that I was feeling less and less welcomed into studio spaces that had been welcoming to me up to that point. That, my weight gain, even though for me it was part of healing, was seen as a bad thing. Like I was somehow neglecting my health, even though it was the healthiest thing that could be happening to me.
For you, yeah.
And so I think the weight stigma was the first to really come up. That relationship that I referenced that was pretty toxic at the time. It was very heterosexual seeming, It wasn't a heterosexual relationship. It was certainly a queer relationship, but it could be read as a straight relationship.
Yeah, it's
And
in the
so,
roles as the complete distinction of the roles
yeah,
where
yeah.
one is this and one is the other. Yeah,
Hmm. And
seeing that definitely.
it had almost gotten hyper, so because because I was so in denial about my own gender identity and really like not willing or able at that moment in time to sort through how I related to the concept of gender, that I felt like I just needed to like play up the femininity and
Hmm. Like
exist as
overcompensate a
exactly
little bit. Hmm.
overcompensate. So I was very feminine presenting, and as I got in touch with a gender identity that was more resonant for me, that I started to present a little less femininely. I became a little more obviously queer. I got into a new relationship that was with a woman, uh, and in that relationship, then people started to realize, right, like that I wasn't straight. And then I started to use different pronouns, and people were like, oh, well, that's new, like, so it was a lot of the same people in the same studios that I was practicing in, but they were witnessing all of this change. And honestly, their reaction wasn't great.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah.
there were certainly members of those communities that seemed accepting and that understood and that really took the time to understand what was going on for me. But I feel like there were other people who wrote me off throughout that experience as like not fitting anymore with
It's
what.
interesting
Yeah.
that what you're sharing because um, I'm thinking in terms of even my spiritual journey.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting that it's spirituality, like it seems wonderful when we are
Mm-hmm.
able to follow it. It's just an amazing thing, we're so
Mm-hmm.
so accepting. We don't see roles, we see spiritual beings.
Mm-hmm.
We're looking for the soul, inside the body. We're not
Yeah.
seeing the body, and it sounds great.
Yeah.
uh, it's amazing. It's just that in practice, you find that it's much harder to do because
Mm-hmm.
it's not always even about the other person.
Mm-hmm.
It's the work that we have to do inside, because by no means would I say that I see beyond all bodies and I only see spiritual, and yes, that's truly been my aim in
Mm-hmm.
life, and that's definitely been part of my meditation practice over the years. But acknowledging that I do put people in boxes,
Mm-hmm.
and that's the work too. So it's not always the work is
Mm-hmm.
you have to be spiritual and you
Yeah.
have to do that. So it's amazing because it's the place where you feel this is where you can really be free to be yourself. And then there is this mirror showing you, on the other end, that we're not there yet.
Mm-hmm.
And there's not that honesty even with ourselves
Yeah.
and with others as to,
Yeah.
hey, I'm still processing this. I'm not quite sure how to fluctuate or change with your changes.
Mm-hmm.
It's okay to say that. It's okay to say, I didn't know that I couldn't handle your change, and
Mm-hmm.
but I'm working on that. And I
Yeah.
always wonder, why can't we just really say that? So to hear that perspective, from your side,
Mm-hmm.
what that would be. I've had years of being in meditation centers and managing and teaching in meditation centers, and always had to have to be okay, because sometimes you still have that mindset who you expect to attend class,
Mm-hmm.
and what they're going to look like and how they're going to behave. And I remember always when I walked down the stairs thinking, that's not my decision to make, that's not my business.
Mm-hmm.
The all I have to do is speak what I'm called to speak,
Yeah.
irregardless, of who that, may be. So thank you for sharing that, because
Sure.
that's a very deep, part that I know, that everyone's actually going through and maybe not really talking about.
Yeah.
I
I
wondered
mean,
though how you transformed that,
mm-hmm.
like
Yeah.
that story of how you were able to manage that. You can be an advocate for that now.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, that's when I really started to realize that this is an access issue, right? Because we all of us in, I think, the yoga community, I guess I shouldn't overgeneralize, but so many of us, we love to and want to be able to maintain that sort of spiritual bypass where we're saying like, well, my practice and my tradition, my spiritual tradition is teaching me that, we're all one, we're all in union with one another, that we're beyond these bodies. And I agree with you, right? In my spiritual practice, that's true. But if we can't access those teachings, if we can't access those classes and those communities that are working towards that spiritual enlightenment, that are recognizing that oneness within us, or that spirit or being beyond the body, then we're never going to be able to really be in that practice in Sangha, right? In community, if we can't access them. And what I was experiencing was like I had been welcomed because I fit into a certain point on everybody's checkbox hierarchy. And now they're questioning that, and I'm finding myself alienated, right? And I was like, this isn't, like, I need this. This is a practice that has been supporting me and helping me heal and help me feel more free to be myself and be happy in my life. I mean, I was depressed for years, and it was the first practice that was really helping me come out of that in a sustainable way. And I was like, if I'm going to be ostracized in this only place that is helping me to heal and feel better, and then have the actual like energy and knowledge and those gems of wisdom from my teachers and from the readings that they might suggest for me and what have you, how am I going to continue on a spiritual path, right? And then I started thinking about all of the people who won't come to studios because the representation in all of the depictions of yoga in the West is the same person or the same archetype of a person, right? And it's so physically focused that, there are plenty of folks who are disabled, folks in larger bodies, folks who are just generally not fit or don't think they're flexible, who aren't even going to approach the space if they think it's a fitness class, right? And that really, that's what lit the fire, right? It really wasn't just about me being able to sustain a practice. It was about the masses of people that I know and people that I want to know and people that I know are out there and that I'm trying to do the work of seeing more fully for who they are. The fact that they were not going to be able to access the teachings that could bring them the freedom that they deserve, and that's rightfully theirs.
Exactly.
So that's where I started to make the transition. I got involved with the Yoga and Body Image Coalition first and started doing more dedicated work around how I had used yoga to help improve my self-image, and started learning some of the lessons and tools that other people had used as through the coalition and through sort of changing up who I followed in the yoga community on Instagram and other platforms. I learned that there were other people doing this that were working to increase representation. The coalition predates me, and started to make those connections and build a new community that, well, more spread out than maybe my home studio in DC, is really here doing the work of trying to make sure that, well, yes, our spiritual practice sees us as, one connected whole, that, we're here in these bodies for now, and we're not going to be able to actually reach that end goal, that enlightened goal, without each other. And that means we all have to have access to the tools.
Exactly. In the work that you've been doing now, do you feel, not just because of the coalition, obviously you're surrounded and in touch with those who are promoting change and creating that, but within the community, outside of the coalition, do you find that there is a change happening, that people are more mindful and more aware that there isn't a specific archetype that will come here, and that are allowing themselves to be educated, trained, and given the tools that they need to be able to create a more accessible space for
Yeah.
the community?
I'm heartened by the change that I do believe I'm seeing. It's slow. I think
Mhm,
it's happening slowly. But I do think that the work is being done and that it's happening, and that I do see it outside of my sort of bubble of accessible yoga practitioners and teachers, right? I When I first started trying to do this work, when I first started trying to teach, period, in a fat body, in a less than perfectly feminine gender presentation, I had a little more trouble finding jobs and retaining students. Um, and I feel like that has mostly stopped happening. But one thing that I would note is that I think part of the reason it has stopped happening is because I've found a little bit of a voice and a little bit of a platform, right? Like you found me on
mhm.
Instagram.
Right,
And with that, right, comes a little bit of, I think, marketability, right?
right.
As diversity and inclusion become kind of buzzword topics in yoga and wellness and mindfulness, and as we continue to exist under capitalism, and thus this industry is a business, that diversity is marketable. And because I have somewhat of a platform, I think spaces also tend to see me as someone to invest in, because I have the potential to maybe put their events and um, their space out there a little bit.
Mhm,
Does
mhm.
that make sense? So it's a little twofold.
Absolutely.
And it feels a little bit sometimes like I've just swapped a position, like one position of power for another, right?
Yeah.
Before being, someone who appeared to be that archetypal, like, not too large white lady, right? Like straight cis appearing person coming into studios and having that power, from where people would look at me and then position me on those hierarchies, to losing some of that when I was coming into who I truly am, and trying to show that to the world, but gaining some amount of power through the platform that I have, and the friends that I have who have platform, right? The people that
Mhm.
I've been lucky enough to work with and learn from. um I Yeah, I mean, and I think so much about power and hierarchy and structure. Like, that's where all of my agency work goes, and so that's
Yes.
what I kind of pick out as standing out to me in that situation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, what would you say,
Mhm.
someone's listening to our conversation and they are struggling with body image,
Mhm.
with gender identity,
Mhm.
um, with anything that doesn't fit into the box that they think they
Mhm.
should be fitting in.
Yeah.
How do you assist? Because I know you're encountering it, that you're doing this work,
Mhm.
but what do you say? How do you get us to begin to see yoga for what it has been for you?
Yeah. I mean, I think representation is really the starting point for that conversation, right? It's like you need to be able to see yourself and see a representation of somebody who you identify with,
Mhm,
in the practice, and receiving benefit from it, and not being pushed out of it, and having to experience that sense of rejection or failure that we so often feel when we get pushed out of other spaces, right? I think a lot of
mhm,
those folks who don't identify with that normative image of a yoga practitioner, they're just afraid to even try, right? Because they're
mhm,
not seeing themselves represented. And like, that's one thing that I can do, right? One thing that I can do is to be as public as possible. And I don't think I'm doing that so much to drive my ego, as I'm doing it because I needed that representation, right?
mhm.
And I still need
Exactly.
it, right? I still need to know that there are other people here, um, in community that I can really understand and relate to. That's part of what keeps me committed to the work that I do and the practice that I'm in.
Mhm.
And so I just want to be that, but I also would then say, like, to folks who are struggling, but might want to use yoga as a tool in their healing, seek out those representations first, right? Like, clear out your Instagram feed of all of the, the crap out there that's making you feel bad about yourself, and like follow some of the accounts that are really putting diverse images out there, and also showing the range of practices that fall within yoga, because it's not just physical movement at all, right? That's one piece of the whole system. And start to get in touch with what does feel good in any way that you can, right? Because I feel like I went through so much of my life feeling crappy in so many ways. And part of figuring out what I wanted and who I wanted to be, how I wanted to show up in the world, and what I wanted to do to help me feel that way started with just being able to feel one good thing, right? It started with just being able to feel one moment of intense desire for something that felt like it came just from me and not from anybody else, and being able to give that to myself. So that requires a little bit of tuning in. So even if like going to a studio class, doing a bunch of asanas, of movements is not like what's up for you right now, like maybe taking a moment to sit and breathe and just notice like what pace your breath's moving at, and maybe try breathing a little more quickly, breathing a little more slowly or deeply, and see what feels good, and start there. And then keep seeking out that feeling of good when you're talking to new people, when you're trying new classes, when you're trying to figure out what to eat for breakfast. Like, I think we need to tap into that sense of desire before we can really tap into our agency and start the work of liberating ourselves from all of the oppressive systems that we exist within.
So powerful. It's funny, I'm saying powerful about what you shared about power is what I was going to say.
Yeah.
And about access. And I know that when I was speaking to you earlier, you were sharing about the work that you've been introduced to in terms of agency, access, and agency. And what are you working on now? What is your focus, and how are you bringing that to life in your teaching, in your private practice, in your own life? How are you seeing the next year happening for you?
Yeah. Wow. The next year it's going to be a whirlwind. I'm sure it's already been a whirlwind since January. Yeah, I've been working in a couple of veins, but very much focused on the idea of exploring access as it relates to agency, and agency as it relates to power, and agency within the individual as sort of a microcosm, but also then taking that out and looking at the macrocosm of society and seeing how these things continue to reflect on larger and larger scales and smaller scales, and then figuring out ways that we can learn this lesson on just one of those levels. Because I think when we actually learn any, even just a scrap of truth, right, like actual truth, it's going to be something that is translatable to all of those different levels, right? So in terms of my work with students in the yoga classroom, and also my personal practice and how I choose to practice yoga now, when I lead movement or when I practice movement, it's with the idea that we need to be able to self-drive that ship a little bit, and like I was just saying about like find the one good thing, the one thing that feels good, right? It's using my body sort of as the vessel for that exploration, for figuring out what it is that feels good, and then figuring out how to balance, right? For me, like I'm busy, and balance in my life, like balancing my calendar and my time, and using my resources in an effective way that's not going to burn me out in some way, requires me to practice a lot of balance. But I think that the most profound thing that my asana practice can do for me is, teach me how to balance in my body, so that I can take that lesson and figure out, what did it take to stand on one leg? and translate that into like, what's the equivalent in my calendar, right? In my work life. And
Exactly.
apply it there, right? And apply it on all these different levels, but not just the ones that affect me personally. Like, I feel compelled by my values and sense of ethics, which come from the system of yoga itself, as I understand it, to be taking that work to the largest possible scales, um, which is also why I advocate on in the larger sense for social equity and social justice, and access both to these spaces and every space. I do a lot of teacher education at this point also. So beyond teaching classes that focus on agency and self-driven movement, I'm also teaching yoga teachers about power, and the way that it shows up in our larger dominant culture, and the way that it seeps into our yoga spaces, and even into the ways that we hold classes, and are taught to teach. You know, in my first teacher training, I was explicitly told that everything that I told the students to do should be framed as a command, that was the only way to keep my students safe, was to tell them exactly what to do and make sure they were following it, and
Wow.
not to make it sound wishy-washy or unclear or questionable. And I, oh God, the way I teach now is, exactly the opposite. Basically, like, everything's an option. If I'm concerned about your physical safety, I might say something to you, but just kind of reframing that conversation, and explaining how, like, if you are a white person, if you are a cisgender person, if you are a straight person, if you hold these positions of power within the hierarchical systems of power and oppression that exist in the larger society, they come into that classroom with you. There's not a way for you to avoid that, right? Because even if you were an enlightened being who could see beyond everybody's, body and identity in their body, your students aren't necessarily coming into class perceiving everybody that way or perceiving
Correct.
you that way.
Mm-hmm.
And, in all likelihood, as we were saying before, you're not all the way past all of your biases anyway, right?
Exactly.
So you're bringing those things in with you. And if you're framing things as a command, then any power that you hold in an unjust hierarchy outside of the room, you're also holding in that space. And that's stripping folks with marginalized bodies and identities of their agency, of their free will. Like,
Mm-hmm.
that's not liberation for all. And if this is a practice of liberation, then that power structure needs to be interrupted so that
Correct.
it actually can be liberatory for everyone. So I'm working with teachers then on how we can practice recognizing the power that we do hold, both based on identities that are privileged in the larger society and in the role of the teacher, because there's a power dynamic there, teacher student as
Yes.
well,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And then how we can work to move towards power sharing and collaboration with students in designing a practice that really serves them in the body that they have right now, that is inclusive of all of their identities, to the best of our abilities. And of course, we can only do the best we can with the resources we have right now. But that means that we need to be constantly seeking out new resources, right? New ways of understanding, new perspectives within our own circles of colleagues and friends, that are diverse perspectives that come from different places and backgrounds and experiences.
It begins by doing one thing, just
Mm-hmm.
doing one thing differently, or being more mindful of one particular, aspect, and
Mm-hmm.
being able to include that aspect in your the individual practice, but also in your teaching and in the studio.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing I know, you are coming up as a speaker at
Mm-hmm.
the Evolution of Yoga Summit in
Yes.
Los Angeles, and that
Mm-hmm.
sounds a little exciting. Can you tell me what it's about?
I'm really excited about it. we have 4 tracks of inquiry for this summit. So attendees will get to choose to stick with one track or explore a couple of different options. But those 4 tracks really represent 4 areas of conversation that are left out of the dominant conversation around the future of yoga in the West, particularly. And those areas are racism and racial equity, cultural appropriation, accessibility, and consent and empowerment. And so each of those tracks then has a couple of co-chairs and 2 or 3 additional panelists, and each of those groups is working collaboratively to come up with a document that sort of summarizes how we view the kind of current state of yoga in the West as it pertains to that subject area, that track area, and then talking about some ways that we might help yoga evolve in the Western world, as we assume that will be the primary attendance of a conference in the United States anyway, though we are certainly trying to keep a more global perspective in mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I'm so touched by the work that all of you have been doing that makes, at least for me personally, and I'm sure that others can relate, makes yoga more accessible as I'm going into the journey from thought-based meditation to yoga in many different ways as I'm exploring that journey. So just gratitude to all of you for doing that, and that you are all coming together to look at the evolution of yoga, creating an amazing blueprint and giving us the tools as we are encountering more and more coming to an introduction of yoga and how to integrate it into their life. And so thank you for that. I'm so grateful for you coming on to the podcast today and this conversation that we've had. I am looking forward to speaking to you again and to see where you are in your practice and what we can all learn and as you're going through the journey. So if you will allow me to invite you as many times.
Absolutely.
I would love that. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I hope to have you soon. Namaste.
Namaste. We'll talk again.
To find out more about Melanie and the incredible strides that are being made in accessible and adaptive yoga, agency and access, find Melanie at Found Space Yoga on social media.